Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Supply Chain Leader Learning Series. My name is Anna McCormick, and I'm the Product Manager for ANAE. We want to welcome our National Accounts Weekly subscribers who are joining us on the call today. We hope you can enjoy this call and get a little inside look of what ANAE is all about. You can see on the screen the other benefits that you will receive with your ANAE membership. And please reach out to me with any questions that you have. You can see my email at the bottom of the screen there. And before we get started, I just have a couple of announcements. As we go through the call, please submit any questions that you have to me via the GoToWebinar chat window, which you can find about 3/4 of the way down on the control panel. You can click on the hand icon, or you can email me at amccormick, MCCORMICK, at sharemovingmedia.com. Also, we have confirmed our ANAE annual conference this year, so please save the date for July 17th and 18th in Chicago. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce John Pritchard, the president of ANAE.
Thank you, Anna. Welcome, everybody, to today's call. Sorry we're running a few minutes late. Just a typical Monday morning for us here at the Association of National Accounts Executives, so I do appreciate you being patient. I guess we were probably optimistic in trying to get something to work right our first call on a Monday morning, but I'm glad you joined us. We have the largest crowd we've ever had for one of these calls because we opened it up to our newsletter that's now about 2.5 months old called National Accounts Weekly. If you're not getting it for the membership, you can check that out at nationalaccountsweekly.com. And it's been a lot of fun doing that. And I want to welcome our guest now, Simrit Sandhu, Executive Director of Supply Chain from the Cleveland Clinic. Simrit, welcome to today's call.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So, again, look forward to the call and hope I can answer any questions that you guys have.
Yeah, I think I'm sure you will. There was great interest in hearing from you. I know you spoke at one of our meetings a couple years ago and were really well received. And just personally, I'm very excited to have you on here. I'm a proud graduate of the Cleveland State University School of Business. So my ears always perk up when you speak or anybody speaks of the Cleveland Clinic. So I'm very proud to have you on today. I appreciate you making time. If you would just give us an overview of your organization so people truly understand the Cleveland Clinic. What is the system comprised of, hospitals and size, and any volume metrics you'd care to share?
Absolutely. So, team, again, Simrit Sandhu, I head up supply chain for the Cleveland Clinic Health System. So I oversee all the contracting, sourcing, procurement, inventory services, materials management, warehouses, the back office, right? The back office of supply chain. Most of you probably interact with my sourcing and contracting organization and have worked with the sourcing and procurement team. I'm not sure if any of you have had interaction with the materials management team, but most of our materials management is done by Cardinal Health as in a just-in-time fashion. So stop me at any time with questions, but what I want to give you is an idea of how large the health system is and specifically what our span of operations includes. So the overall bed size today at the Cleveland Clinic is almost in excess of 4,000 beds. We have almost 12 hospitals, including 2 mini health systems, one in Florida and one in Akron that we oversee. We have a large academic presence through the main campus. Our spend is almost $2.5 to $3 billion, of which almost $800 million is pharma. We have a very large pharmaceutical spend. All of the pharma contracting is done through my team, so our span of control includes pharmacy. We have an international presence, so in addition to those 12 hospitals and myriad physician offices and FHCs and surgical centers, we also own and operate a hospital in Abu Dhabi. We operate, not own, I apologize, a hospital in Abu Dhabi. We are about to launch a hospital, I'm not sure if you're all aware of, in London, UK. So we will be opening in 2020 a hospital in London that will be launched and named shortly. So you're beginning to see this mindset of a national provider ranked number 2. You're all familiar with the clinic, so we're ranked number 2 from a U.S. News and World Report's perspective, but also trying to maintain and create an international brand and putting a stake in the ground by probably launching one of the largest international hospital bills known in the country today. So that's a major, large next step. We've had a change in our C-suite. We have a brand new CEO, Dr. Mihaljevic. Dr. Toby Cosgrove led the clinic for many, many years, and as he retired, he's been replaced by Dr. Mihaljevic, who comes to us from heading up Abu Dhabi. So the CEO of Abu Dhabi, our international hospital, is now the CEO of the entire global health system. So is that helpful? Does that give you an idea of how large we are, how our spend compares to other health systems? About $3 billion. I point out the $800 million in pharma because I think that's a very, very large independent spend. We have almost 1.5 million PO lines we process, almost 1,500 pure contract or price agreements and items. That doesn't count services and professional services contracts. If you count those, it's upwards of 3,000. We have almost 133 inventory locations. We have a consolidated service center we operate from main campus, but are slowly migrating into a just-in-time inventory services model, primarily in partnership with Cardinal Health. A lot of our work is RFID enabled, including products in our ORs. We've launched the WaveMark platform, which is an RFID platform that takes product in the clinical areas and ties it into our EMR, Epic. So we are a end-to-end connected supply chain where we're trying to connect our work at the patient bedside to supply chain. Is that a decent overview?
Oh yeah, it's excellent. I think a lot of people think of the Cleveland Clinic as a world class brand in clinical care, but when you kind of and there's so many other things unique about you, certainly a national presence as well as an international presence, but when you think about the Cleveland Clinic and your unique supply chain opportunities and or challenges, could you speak to that a little bit? How in the world do you supply the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland as well as Florida, and then also put best practices in place so that you truly have a clinically integrated supply chain, coming up in London and as well as your other locations around the world?
Very a great question, right? One of the things that we agreed upon at the very inception of our journey in creating a shared services-based supply chain was that physician and clinical engagement in decision-making was extremely important. So we're a pretty standardized formulary. For most of you understand we have a limited choice portfolio for most of our contracts. So 2 hip and knee manufacturers. We have pretty much sole sourced or dual sourced every implant category. And in doing so, as we manage both the Ohio footprint, but also our Las Vegas and Florida footprints, driving compliance and shared services model is based on driving local stakeholder engagement. So we have instituted medical directors in supply chain, individuals that facilitate service line-based conversations around clinical decision-making. So what you'll find in our clinical and our pharmacy world is integrated pharmacists and physicians into supply chain by service line that are ensuring that we're formulary driven. We're focused not just on contracting, but patient care, where every product has a utilization guideline. On the business side, be it marketing or HR, we have a business partner model where we have subspecialized category managers that are working with the business owners to co-create strategy and execution against it. So the days of a standalone contracting arm that just does price agreements are gone. To truly drive a shared services model across states and across service lines, this idea of more of a clinically engaged or business engaged supply chain that has access to not just the contract, but the utilization and life cycle of that contract post-implementation. is really important. On the material side, we've done it by creating site-specific materials leadership that is centrally managed. We've taken the entire footprint. We've organized it by zones in the U.S. All those zone directors are implementing, the shared services decisions. We've created a center of excellence for the U.S. The COE is exporting best practices. It's also doing audits on cost savings. It's doing audits on par levels. It's sharing inventories across sites. When it comes to the international side of the house, our centers of excellence converge upon designing the model. So we're involved up front in setting up the supply chain from scratch and ensuring that we're exporting the right practices, putting them into local context. But B, we place periodic supply chain resources from the U.S. into those facilities so that they are partners on an ongoing basis. The UAE model or the Abu Dhabi model runs independently as in it's self-operated locally. We, however, we have a consultant embedded from my team that goes there monthly, as well as my team and I support them remotely. The UK is going to be different. The UK is going to be an owned site, and we're actually standing in that up ground up. We've hired an individual to run it that will line into my organization. And again, the goal is center of excellence based standardized practices, a global back office, including an ERP that can support across countries. So a lot of interesting work to happen yet.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, for years we've been speaking to progressive supply chain leaders, trying to get voice of the customer to suppliers. And the suppliers, just like the providers, are on a very wide gamut of sophistication. And one thing that, when I think of the Cleveland Clinic, I think of a clinically integrated supply chain. You talk of medical directors in supply chain, centers of excellence, formulary and standardization. In the most basic terms, can you explain why is clinical integration, a clinically integrated supply chain, why is that so important when I think a lot of suppliers feel like to win business, they have to be the lowest unit price every time and displace a legacy supplier? But I think it's much bigger than that when you think of a clinically integrated supply chain and a value-based value proposition for providers that are best in class. Can you touch on that? I know that's a lot of question, but I think a lot of suppliers are still trying to get to that next level of understanding a clinically integrated supply chain.
That's an interesting question, right? So for most of you on the phone, I will confess I once worked the other side of the shop, right? I worked on the device side and I worked on the distributor side, and I live the same dilemma that you do, right? So this idea of moving beyond price makes a lot of sense, but the hospitals still want the lowest price. And what does clinically integrated supply chain mean? So I will try and describe it fairly from both sides. One, there is this innate belief on the provider side, and having lived both sides, I say it with great humility, that the margins on the manufacturer side are inordinately larger than the margins on the provider side. So this unit price battle wages on, as in a fairer context to what pricing transparency needs to look like. Having said that, price is not the sole decision-making criteria in a clinically integrated supply chain. In our world, primarily what we've come to the realization of is we can buy the cheapest product, but if it means using more of it or not getting the outcomes you need, then it is a wasted effort. So in simplistic terms, I will give you an example of a clinically integrated supply chain is looking at products in use and motion versus a standalone items on a contract. So my team has to study costs by procedure on a real-time basis by practicing physicians. We need to be able to look at something as simple as I can buy nitric oxide very cheap, but am I using nitric oxide on the right patients? And should I be doing a volume-based contract, or should I pay more for a lower quantity? A clinically integrated supply chain is beginning to understand why we are using hemostatic agents in some cases and not on others. It's beginning to understand that we need to be less worried about the wound closure device and more worried about why we're using the wound closure device at all, right? So a clinically integrated supply chain is beginning to understand the utilization patterns of that product and its life cycle in its entirety, and not as a pure acquisition on a contract. It's meaningfully engaging your stakeholders to make that larger decision. Does that make sense to you?
It really does. And, when you have such a dispersed area of the world to give care to protect your brand, you absolutely have to have great data, best-in-class data, right? Because if you had an issue across the world, it's going to be on the Wall Street Journal tomorrow, and vice versa. If you don't have best-in-class care, that will be too. So I think it's real interesting to do that. I think the diversity of where you're giving care lends a level of complexity we don't see in a traditional regional, health system.
And having managed both pharma and the non-pharma side of the clinical shop, I can tell you there's greater granularity of understanding the pharma data, right? You have these unique NDC numbers, you have formularies. You can walk out and through P&T committees truly manage a pharma portfolio. At least we have done very well at the clinic for years. On the med-surg and the implant side, this inability for us to truly agree upon these GS1 standards in a timely fashion, implement data standards, have point-of-use documentation, tying product to patient outcome has been impossible. In fact, it's been mostly you guys, the account managers and the sales teams, that have had better access to data tied to the product and the patient. So unfortunately, in some recalls, the manufacturers had better access as to what product was brought in what lot and put in what patient versus getting it out of our clinical systems or our supply systems. So those are some of the fundamental problems that we are trying to solve for. How uniquely can we tie this product information into our clinical systems and our case scheduling? You're wasting so much effort dragging product into my hospitals because it's just in case, right? Maybe the doctor would need this. We understand these cases are scheduled. They didn't communicate with us in time. Let's just leave $1 million of ortho product in the hospital just in case they need it, AKA consignment or trunk stock or whatever it is that we call. The real issue is we can't seem to tie our clinical data, our scheduling, and our physician usage patterns to better demand planning for manufacturing. So another way to get out of this price management issue or just lowest price is to help manufacturers better predict demand as well. There's lots of room for opportunity. People argue about, is Amazon going to come into healthcare and what does the future of healthcare supply chain look like? The reality is still we can predict demand, which is tie all our product usage and clinical data into case scheduling and a predictive pattern. We can't really leverage any of that back office capability. So I see a lot of improvement being made, at least at the Cleveland Clinic, in tying our supply chain to the patient record, case schedules, physician demand patterns.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just some statistics that that come off the top of my head. There's $5 billion in trunk stock. A third of everything in the OR of supplies are wasted, and 84% of surgeries are planned. Where I think we struggle, and you would be a good one to kind of comment on this, having been with distribution, a supplier, and now on the buy side of it, is I find collaboration within the U.S. healthcare supply chain to be stunted oftentimes because we can't decide how we'll split up the benefit. Said another way, using Detroit as an example, if Detroit and its suppliers, an auto manufacturer and its suppliers can reduce the cost of the total supply chain, they don't fight over who benefits for it. The whole channel benefits, but maybe not equally. And it seems like us in healthcare, we can't even agree on data enough to say, okay, if we took $1 million out of our supply chain, you'd get 12%, we'd get 88%, or how it would split up. And I think that works against us sometimes. And I don't know if you have a comment on that. It goes back to risk-shared contracting. 10 years ago, I would have said, I would have bet my house that we would be much farther down the road in risk share and those types of agreements. But I don't know if you have a comment on that. Kind of out in left field, I know.
No, it's not. It's completely tied to what I'm talking about. I've had many manufacturers approach my team with risk-based contracts in the past, and I've said, till I have the data to measure it, you can't do a risk-based contract, right? Because all you're going to get into is legal arbitration at the end.
Yeah.
And aligning incentives means data transparency between both partners. They need access to our clinical information. We need to tie our supply data to our outcome information better. Two, I think it needs larger health systems. The reason we weren't ready 10 years ago, my humble opinion, is because we still are a world of standalone smaller hospitals. It's very hard for manufacturers to interact with, and I don't know how they do it. I know it's a losing proposition. There's rural access hospitals, there are community hospitals, there are these large academics, and then you have the New World Order. You have CHI Dignity. You have Providence Ascension. You have the Kaiser sizes, right? As this market, if our market goes that route, you will find that it'll become easier for manufacturer and provider to see things through a new lens. I mean, you've seen Intermountain Ascension and Trinity just announced this whole idea of doing something different in pharma, right? I think larger scale allows both parties to partner better together.
Yeah, it's interesting because I always ask the question, you mentioned you have $2.5 billion, $3 billion in contracted supplies, $800 million in pharma. How big is big enough? To me, that seems substantial. You change suppliers with that kind of spend, that supplier is certainly going to notice it, and somebody's going to notice the win. I just don't know what is big. How big is big enough? I've been writing about it for 5 years. People ask me all the time, how many IDNs are we going to end up with? And I think there's 40 cities that have 1 million people or more. So if each of those have 2, 3, 4 IDNs, we're still at a few hundred IDNs. And I always kind of wonder, how big is big enough? Because
how big is big enough?
Yeah, it sure does seem like we're in pursuit of being bigger, right? Big's getting bigger.
Yes.
There's no doubt about it. You named all the examples.
I mean, I think if you represent 10% of the market, you're material, right? So I may have 2.5 to 3 billion, but of that, 800 million is pharma, about another 500 million is med surg, or 600 million is med surg. There's IT, there's professional services, there's purchase services. So it's not standalone 2.5 billion in implants, right? So if you compare our size to the manufacturer sales volume, I think if I was as large as probably I'd say probably 10%, 5 to 10% of the market, that's when I start materially impacting the world. And that's what we've tried to do, right? The problem is the larger you get, team, the less we seem able to apply a formulary and create a standardized utilization guideline based program. So and what we are trying to do is grow meaningfully. As we grow, still maintain physician engagement, have more of these standardized decision-making commitments, so that when we contract with the manufacturer and we make a commitment, we can live with it, and they can see the benefits too. So this whole idea of launching a GPO accelerator out of the Cleveland Clinic was an idea that came out of that commitment. If the Cleveland Clinic can create a pharmacy and a clinical supply formulary and create meaningful compliance to it, how can we take that principle and align with other like-minded providers? So candidly, we're hoping that approach helps us even as we get larger. How do you take this idea of not just growing in size, but in parallel, maintaining commitment and compliance to your vendor partners?
Yeah, the value they're looking for.
Yes.
Yes. Will you take us through your GPO relationship, Accelerate, how that all works? Just many of our members probably are not contracted suppliers of yours, but if you could explain that would be really helpful.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that you'll probably see us do is a lot of hospitals across the country started forming aggregation networks. And you've all been familiar with aggregation networks, geography or large health center-centric organizations that condense or aggregate volume of a lot of commodity product and get better pricing for it. The GPOs, the national GPOs like Vizient and Premier, began to understand that to stay relevant in that conversation, they had to become the backbone of that aggregation network. So they started sponsoring those networks. They became the back office for it, helping with things such as putting contracts to paper, rebate administration. And those members started then contracting with all of you. When they came together, none of them had a standardized formulary. So it was a little painful. They all had to get together, contract, and source and create those commodity contracts. After they finished some of the commodity contract work, they found that they could get about probably 5 to 10% better pricing, and they tried to move that effort into physician preferenced items in pharma. And what they found was that the formula that worked on commodities wasn't really transferring to the more preferenced clinical items or pharma. And it wasn't really about supply leaders sitting around with maybe non-physicians and voting on contracts. It really became one where you had to meaningfully engage nurses, doctors, pharmacists in a conversation about utilization and standardization. So we at the clinic at that point realized that we were at a crossroads. We wanted to form a company of our own, and our secret sauce, we believed, was taking our engagement model of pharmacy and the physician engagement and seeing that if we could take our work to that physician preferenced item or clinically preferenced item in pharma work. So we spent time exporting our standardized formulary and utilization guidelines to providers that want to go down this journey. It's tough, right? Because when they start, they want almost 12 to 24 months in trying to make that journey happen. They've never engaged their physicians in conversations. They've never really had a cohesive pharmacy supply chain relationship. And we're helping them create medical directors, connect their C-suites into these efforts so that over a period of 1 to 2 years, and often even into 3 years, teach them how to be part of a larger community or ecosystem in supply chain where you can start standardizing and working on supply paths for some of those most preferenced items in pharmacy. We still do the aggregation on the commodity side, but what we're trying to do is figure out if those commodities can also find a different path where instead of multi-sourcing some of those commodities or dual sourcing them, is there room to look at things such as private labeling? Is there room to look at things such as having a minority market share vendor gain market share and give lower pricing instead of pure aggregation? So our success in commodities has come from taking the number 3 or 4 commodity manufacturer and awarding them the contract versus the number 1 market share vendor. That's typically been our path. So, AKA, we've I think on skin adhesives worked with a vendor who probably had less than 5% market share and displaced the largest vendor. We've looked at suture. We've used Covidien versus Ethicon. Not everything has been very easy or successful, but I think this idea of willingness to change and understand if we can meaningfully employ supply chain to see if physicians and supply chain and pharmacy coming together can lead to some both cost benefits, but clinical advancement has been a very, very differentiating factor for our GPO. Our GPO doesn't purely aggregate volume. It tries to engage these clinicians and these pharmacists in the conversation about change.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a couple things there that are really counterintuitive to me. One is kind of the whole idea of the Cleveland Clinic, a great brand, not being necessarily attached at the hip with the market share leaders. I would think those market share leaders would, do anything to make sure they had the Cleveland Clinic's business just as a pure vanity play of their customer list. So that's kind of interesting that you've been able to find value in 3rd and 4th place market share leaders. The other is just the nuance of having clinic in your name, I think, gives the feeling of great, the ability of physicians to have great variety and what they want to use. But what they've bought into is the process and the system, necessarily not the independence of variety. And I think that's lost on people, right? Where they're in early in the process, the evaluation, and then they're all in the system of what they use once that's been vetted through the system. Could you touch a little bit on product selection? You touched on the medical directors being in supply chain, but how is a simple product or even device vetted and evaluated? How does it go through the system?
A very interesting question, right? So I'll start with what I called our change management pyramid. Our change management pyramid talks about product selection at 3 different levels. One, the involvement of the C-suite in decision making for certain types of products and services, the role of medical directors in products that cross service lines, but the very, very important role of creating physician service line champions or nurse service line champions that become the facilitators of product selection and conduits product selection by service line. So while I have a OR product committee and a service line based product committee, if we're looking at technologies, we have service line champions both within Cleveland Clinic, but in Accelerate members that become the face of evaluating technology. I have embedded into supply chain product evaluation experts with statistics and nursing backgrounds whose job it is to condense and collect independent data on the product and facilitate trials with the sourcing team. But it's these service line champions, these physicians by service line that are truly the face of that product selection. What we've informed our team of is the decision is going to be made not on price, but on the expert opinion of the stakeholder based on the unbiased information that is collected by the supply chain team. So our job is to collect and provide the clinical data, which we collect from the vendors, from third-party databases, our internal outcomes databases, our trial data that is prevalent both for us and our members. We present it in a forum where these service line champions or physicians can digest and interpret it. It's discussed in those committees, and a decision, often not very popular, but made in a unified fashion, is made that the team agrees to be compliant to. We also agree that if a new technology or an indication is found that is not covered by the existing product or contract, that we create a mechanism for that technology to come through. We do not stunt innovation. If tomorrow you were to build a widget that was had a unique indication and was better for a certain case type, we clearly make that product available to our physicians. Our physicians are looking for choice for certain reasons, not across the board. We're trying to remove the word preference with evidence. So if you were to create, we often find that the new product that's released is great for a certain patient population or indication. Our problem, once it comes on the shelf, instead of just being used for that patient population or indication, it gets legs and walks, and is soon being used for every case type. So it's monitoring that utilization, being able to tie that utilization to our purchase data that helps us make sure that we bring in that choice when it's needed, but that it's not non-compliant to the contract, and that we're measuring it. It's a very long answer, but I'm trying to for it to be valuable.
No, it's interesting. I mean, that's the battle we see all the time too, and it's interesting to see how you work with it. What are you doing for purchase services? Have you put some emphasis around trying to aggregate and contracts for services? Is that part of the $2.5 billion to $3 billion spend?
It is. Almost $500 million of this is purchase services, and it's being managed internally through my non-clinical teams. And I'll tell you, we're not as great at it yet as we should be. So if I were to say the room for opportunity or opportunity for growth, we are really focused this year on purchase services and IT, because I think those two words still are ripe for more or better standardization and aggregation of buying power. So what we've started doing is we started creating expertise within supply chain. So instead of just having a clinical or non-clinical sourcing team with expertise in ortho and heart and nursing and pharmacy. So if I haven't mentioned that, that's how we're organized. We bring in people with clinical backgrounds to head up clinical sourcing. We have a pharmacist who heads up pharmacy sourcing. On the non-clinical side, we have somebody that came from Delphi and General Motors that does all the admin general and facilities. We're now investing in resources that come from, IT spend portfolios or professional services backgrounds to contract for those spend areas. In fact, we just recruited someone from Kaiser's IT team to do our IT sourcing.
Interesting. You touched on something early that kind of caught my attention, that you're sort of moving away from a consolidated service center back to a prime distribution model.
Yes.
It's funny because a lot of the systems that go to a consolidated service center do it with great fanfare and are in the headlines. But when they go back to prime distribution, they kind of do it quietly. What went into your choice to do that? Why did you decide to do that?
So two things, right? I firmly believe that the CSE model probably has a market-relevant presence for certain geographies and sizes, right? For me, in my geography, with Cardinal Health having its headquarters in Columbus, 3 warehouses within a 2-hour driving distance, maintain and aggregating case pick on items that are, less than $1 makes little sense to me. So the pure math and economics of your geography, your size, and your focus starts shifting. So what my lesson learned has been is that a consolidated service center makes sense for a reason, an existence that has to be beyond supply chain. When you start talking about sterile compounding, lab services, aggregating your 3PL across, many back office functions, probably a good idea. Our CSC was more supply chain focused, and for me, it became this idea of, am I going to focus my energies on the penny products or the dollar store, or am I moving my focus to the ORs and the procedural areas? I've staked my career on it's an inverted pyramid. The money is being spent in the ORs and the procedural areas, and the supply chain leaders are too busy managing the warehouses, right? So it's where I'm trying to meaningfully change the use of my time and resources.
Yeah, that's well said. It'll be interesting to watch. The other thing you commented on was technology and IT. This is going to be kind of a curveball to you, but we talk about the clinically integrated supply chain. Isn't there a technologically integrated supply chain too? I mean, everything is on the network. Everything's talking to each other. We know where everyone is all the time and what they're doing. And if you would just put on the lens of talking to the suppliers at this point, and the responsibility they have, and also the liability they have of being on those networks. We saw just last week a hospital paid, I think, $55,000 or something to a cyber attacker to unlock their files. It was absolutely chilling. I felt like I was reading a Stephen King novel. But I really am concerned about how interconnected the technology is between suppliers, providers, supply chain. And I think that's going to become way more complex the next few years. And I think suppliers really need to take home the message of what their responsibility is as well as their liability.
I agree. I think, what you're going to find, team, on the phone is, especially as we start contracting for more devices that have data backends or systems. So if you're a supplier for IV pumps or beds, things are no longer products. They're all technology. Almost everything has a digital backbone that then has to feed either Epic or a patient record. Think about what we're trying to do. We're trying to say every product needs to get tied to our patient record. And more of these products are digitally interfaced. Or B, if you're transacting with us, you're touching our backbone or ERP in some way. And we are very, so be it in our contract language or in working with these third-party providers of digital platforms, talking very seriously about what is that unified data standard, what security protocols are we all following. And a completely unrelated but curveball, as you're putting it, is what does the advent of online networks, as in buying networks, do for us? Do we see a world 20 years from now where it's an open market and everyone buys stuff on Amazon, right? Maybe we don't get there. But for a subset of products, we do. What does that mean for data standards? What does that mean for every one of us? And interestingly enough, that may or may not happen, but pushing ourselves into understanding what technology security protocols as well as back office integrations would need to happen to make something like that important or possible is important right now.
Yeah, it'll be real interesting to watch, the next few years. The last question, Simran, I'd like to pose to you. I've known you for a couple years now. You're always willing to participate. And one big theme you constantly talk about, and actually it's in the latest issue of the Journal of Healthcare Contracting from December 2017. You grace our cover for that. If anybody would like to see it, they can go to jhconline.com for the Journal of Healthcare Contracting. But
please don't see my picture. It really embarrasses me.
It's a lovely picture. It's a wonderful way. But whenever you speak, write, or participate, you always talk about change management and the ability to have those skills and apply to it and being comfortable in that environment. I would contend that our providers, our IDNs and our supply chain leaders have changed greatly in the last 10 years. And I think there's still a lot more change the suppliers are going to have to go through in a very rapid time frame to stay relevant and best in class. And just why is change management always so important for you to talk about and bring up and actually thrive, as you say, thrive in that environment, not just survive it?
Well, it's an interesting world, right? So for most of you that have done this for a living for years, you've probably seen this change. Supply chain was a very back office function. We transacted POs, we ran warehouses, and the cash flow in our health systems was fluid enough that was pretty much the role. Choice was rampant. We were a back office PO transacting function that put things on contract, made sure product flowed. And slowly the reimbursement model shifted. And I always say follow the flow of money, right? That's how the world goes round. We all follow the flow of money. And as the reimbursement model shifted and we started realizing that certain DRGs started making less money. Initially, we started contracting and trying to reduce costs for those DRGs or procedures. You've all followed the change in the reimbursement models of cardiology and pain and all those wonderful service lines. We started seeing periodic shifts following those revenue models. And then came the world of population health, value-based contracting, doing more with less and making less and less money. And I've seen the mindset of recruiting supply chain leadership. The C-suite started understanding a different supply leader and a different supply chain was needed. And I'm a big believer that health systems that are beginning to start understanding that supply chain is a driver of a cost infrastructure, with 35% of your overall back office expense is supply chain. That this idea to change their DNA, their footprint, to proactively manage that asset, and the skill sets and appetite for supporting that is changing the market too. So I think A, you're getting a different skill set in that job, but B, you're also getting different level of executive support and making that job successful.
It's very well said. You know, I agree with you completely. Supply chain has gone from an activity to absolutely handling an asset of the organization. And I think that's a material change when you step back and really look at it. Simrat Sandhu, Executive Director of Supply Chain Cleveland Clinic, I want to thank you for your time today. You've been a very enlightening guest, always generous with your time and insight. Thank you kindly for joining us. Thank you, all of you, and hopefully this was useful. So take care. Thanks. Bye. To our listeners, I'd like to tell you we have a couple of great guests coming up. Actually, we have visitors and members on the today. So hopefully those that are visiting would be interested in joining. I'll give you just a couple of the benefits. The next couple of guests we have are Donna Van Vlera from Parkview in Indiana, Leanne Bourne from Fairview in Minnesota, Jake Gronwald with Presence Health. And we have dozens of past recordings on the website available for members, including Yale New Haven, Texas Health Resources, BJC, Providence, St. Joe. In addition to that, you can listen to recordings of past panels we've had at our meetings, get discounts at upcoming meetings that we have, and it's all for under $300 a year. I highly encourage you to look into it. And with that, I'll thank everybody for listening today and hand it back to Anna McCormick to wrap today's call.
This concludes our call for today. Thank you so much, John, for your time, and we hope you all have a great week. Thank you.